hopefully you took the opportunity. 2 Chronicles, chapter number 17. Yeah. Don't believe everything you read. The screen is wrong. It should be 2 Chronicles, all right? 2 Chronicles, chapter number 17. That was my confusion this morning. I was still thinking it was 1 Chronicles, and it was 2 Chronicles. Hopefully you took the time to read it. That's what I was trying to say 4 times now. Because there's a lot to the story. There really is. And if you did the bonus points, which I'll let God know, if you just let me know and I'll let God know on Judgment Day that you did the bonus points and you can get some bonus points. No. The first Kings all the way through to the 2 Kings, it's a large portion. You think, oh, that's a large portion. But all of those characters, Jehoshaphat, Ahab, Jezebel, Elijah, Elisha, major characters in the Bible, all are at the same time. They're all overlapping. They exist in contemporaries with each other. So it covers a lot of space, but there's a lot going on. That's why I wanted you to go read it yourself, so that you can get to hear, and hopefully saves me some time and saves us all some time with some of the backstory of it all. Jehoshaphat is where we're at. This is continuation of a series that I never really intended to go as long as it has, and we might even scratch out one more next week along these same lines out of the book of 2 John. But it has to do with mixed marriages and mingling and godly and the ungodly. And ultimately it comes down to the doctrinal teaching of biblical separation. Biblical separation, being that church separation, personal separation, is absolutely a biblical teaching and is taught all the way through the Bible of being separate, being distinct. And Jehoshaphat, as we've called it tonight, is a case study of a godly compromiser. Jehoshaphat is a godly compromiser. We looked last week, as way of introduction, we said this about mixed marriages. And we started this as an intro to Job. It's evolved beyond an intro to Job. But Genesis 4, where Seth and Cain had 2 distinct cities, 2 distinct lines, very distinct distinct lineages. Then you find that the sons of God and the daughters of man, and then you all the way through that we find this, that mixed marriages lead to apostasy. Now apostasy, I realised halfway through I never really defined what apostasy is. I just presumed, which is a bad thing for anyone, any of the young men learning to preach. Don't just presume that people know what words mean. Give the definitions of them. Apostasy is a falling away. It means where they once were followers, adhering to Christianity, and they apostatize. It's not unique to Christianity, because you can be an apostasy. Apostasy can happen in Islam. It can happen to Judaism. In fact, they are known to be they falling away. They've apostatized from Moses. So the word means to fall away, to go backwards. We said this, that mixed marriages lead to apostasy, and apostasy leads to the judgment of God. We used multiple illustrations last week to make that point, all of them showing how the godly son married an ungodly wife and the issues and the problems that came about. We looked at Genesis 6, we looked at the teachings of Balaam, the Mosaic Law taught about it, Solomon, Ezra, James is mentioned, the Revelation, the Church of Pergamos. All of those are illustrations of this same principle, that mixed marriages leads to apostasy, and apostasy to the judgment of God. Now, we're looking at Jehoshaphat because we used Jehoshaphat in passing, but I wanted to come back and have a look at it as a case study this evening. Chapter 17, and just the first few verses, lays the foundation of who Jehoshaphat was. Asa dies, his father, and Jehoshaphat takes his place just a few generations after Solomon. Jehoshaphat, verse 1, his son reigned in his stead of Asa and strengthened himself against Israel, and he placed forces in all the fenced cities of Judah and set garrisons in the land of Judah and in the cities of Ephraim, which Asa his father had taken. And the Lord was with Jehoshaphat, because he walked in the ways of his father David and sought not unto Baalim. but sought to the Lord God of his father, and walked in his commandments, and not after the doings of Israel. Therefore the Lord established the kingdom in his hand, and all Judah brought to Jehoshaphat presents, and he had riches and honor in abundance, and his heart was lifted up in the ways of the Lord. Moreover, he took away the high places and groves out of Judah. And chapter 17 lays a very solid foundation of who Jehoshaphat was. He was a godly man who feared God. He really was. He feared God. He kept the commandments of God. He walked in the ways of David, his father. So David, Solomon, and then you have Rehoboam, Asa, and then Jehoshaphat. He said he walked in the ways of David. He was a man after David's heart, and David was a man after God's heart. He was a godly man as he walked and as he served God. And it deliberately and distinctly says that he walked in the ways of the commandments of God, and he sought to the Lord the God. He sought God, sought God, as we have on our wall here. But it says also in verse 3 that he walked in his commandments, God's commandments, and not after the doings of Israel. What you may not have read in the readings this week is about the backstory of Israel. Now, when Saul, David, Solomon, they were all kings, the first 3 kings of Israel. That was a unified Israel, all 12 tribes. After Solomon's death, then the kingdom was split. It was split into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The southern kingdom composed of 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The other 10 tribes were all in the north, and they split off and they had their own king. Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom. So there was this division in Israel with these northern kingdoms and the southern kingdoms. The capital of the southern kingdom was Jerusalem. And at Jerusalem was Solomon's temple, glorious in splendor. It was where all of Solomon's gold, all of Solomon's wealth, all of Solomon's architecture built into the city of Jerusalem. It was the crowning glory of Israel. And for all the Jews, their pride and they had such pleasure in Solomon's temple and worshiping the Most High God, and the temple that Solomon built for him. It was one of the feats of that world. It was worth traveling to, and people would talk about Solomon's temple and how it was ornate, and the carvings and the gold and everything about it. Well, when Jeroboam became king in the northern kingdoms, he said, you know what? If we keep letting them go down into Jerusalem, into the southern kingdom now, and we let them keep going down there to worship, their hearts will then be reunited with the king of Judah, and we will lose our power and supremacy here in the northern kingdoms. So he said, we need to stop them from going down into Jerusalem to worship at the temple, and we will set up. So he set up in Samaria, and he set up in Beersheba, Dan, at the very north. He set up places of worship, and he just basically picked out of his own head dates, and he just set up the basis of men to be priests, and he set up this false it was Judaism, but not with the authority that the Levites had, that was through the Levitical line in the temple. So there was this worship going on, there were sacrifices that were taking place in the northern. It was this false kind of religion, though it was Judaism. It was a false sense of worship. So when Jehoshaphat comes along, it says that he did not walk after the doings of Israel. He didn't go by that false religion and that the false worship that they were doing in the northern kingdom. He kept to the purity. It was like he was orthodox. He was true in his beliefs and stayed true to the teachings of the Word of God. And the Levites were there, and the high priests were there, and the Levitical order was there, and the Davidic covenant was there. All of the things that God had put in place were going through Jerusalem. So he didn't walk after Israel and their false religion that they had up there. So he had a good start. He had a strong start. But then you have in chapter 18 the defining flaw of Jehoshaphat. It defined him, who he was, and it defines his ministry or his kingship. It defines him as an individual and the legacy that he left. In chapter number 18, you find this. Now Jehoshaphat had riches and honor in abundance. He was a very wealthy, prosperous king of Judah. In fact, in Kings, you would have read, if you did that, you would have read how large his army was. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men. He was a strong, mighty man in the world at his particular time. He was military power. He had wealth on his side. He had honor on his side, riches on his side. God was on his side. And then you find, and he joined affinity with Ahab. Now that affinity word might not be overly familiar with us today, but it's very significant because affinity means the relation contracted by marriage. This was a marriage contract that he entered into. He made a covenant, he made a league with the northern kingdom, Ahab being the king up there, and he entered into this covenant with him, and this covenant, this league, this relation was contractual by marriage between a husband and his wife. So the affinity means this: the relation contracted by marriage between a husband and his wife's kindred, and between a wife and her husband's kindred. So it wasn't just that they gave his son to their daughter. You find that it was also a connection of his family with their family. The kindreds, the family, the kinfolk were now joined in what they had done. So he goes and makes friendship with the northern kingdom who had split off, who had left, who had done all these things. He wants to try and unify, maybe as a heart, maybe it's his heart for unity with those who have left, and he wants to join affinity with them and say, hey, we're all Jews, we were once all part of the same kingdom once upon a time when our fathers David and Solomon were ruling, and now we have split, but he says we're going to join affinity, we're going to join our families back together. But the problem was, Ahab was wicked, and his wife was even more wicked. Jezebel. Jezebel is synonymous. No one has a child these days and says, well, maybe there are some, that calls their daughter Jezebel. Jezebel in the Bible, any kind of casual reading of the Bible, Jezebel is synonymous with wickedness. She is the pinnacle of evil women in the Bible. And so Ahab is married to Jezebel. Now he has joined an affinity, and he has now linked these families, his family with their family, and up there is Baal worship. Jezebel wasn't even a Jew. She came from the Zidonians. She was the daughter of the king of the Zidonians, and she brought in the priesthood of Baal worship. So there was now idol worship, and Baal was now was infiltrated. There was all the priests that were worshipping Baal and leading Israel into Baal worship. And it says that Ahab sinned wickedly above all his that came before him, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did more evil, because he had Jezebel to wife. And now Jehoshaphat is joining an affinity. He's made this a link with his marriages to join in with them. Affinity also means this: it means agreement, relation, conformity, resemblance, connection, as the affinity of sounds, of colours, or of language. So there is this connection and there is this link where they are now going to look and sound and be similar. That's what the word affinity means. It's all connected in that word. So we have here Jehoshaphat making the defining flaw of his is realised by joining affinity with Ahab. Now in chapter 19 and verse 2, the flaw is rebuked by God. Look at chapter 19 of 2 Chronicles, and it says in verse 1, and Jehoshaphat the king of Judah returned to his house in peace in Jerusalem. He goes and has war with Ahab, not with him, but they go and fight together, and he says, like you are, like I am, we're together in one, and we'll just go do these things together. And then it says here, the Jehu, chapter 19, verse 2 of 2 Chronicles, and Jehu the son of Hanani, the seer, which seer is prophet, went out to meet him and said to the king Jehoshaphat, shouldest thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? Wherefore, therefore is wrath upon thee from before the Lord. So Jehu goes and sees him, the prophet, the son of the prophet, goes to see Jehoshaphat on his way coming back, and he says, are you going to go help the ungodly? You're going to go help Ahab and Israel, and you're going to go and help those who hate the Lord? So that's what God said about the northern kingdom. They don't love me up there. In fact, they have brought Baal worship in. They hate me, and they're false prophets. And he says, and you're linking yourself with them who hate me. Shouldest thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? Therefore is wrath upon thee from the Lord. So this affinity brought the anger of God. But it also says in verse 3, nevertheless, there are good things found in thee, in that thou hast taken away the groves out of the land, and hast prepared thine heart to seek God. So Jehoshaphat is godly, but he's a godly compromiser. He's compromising by joining affinity with the northern kingdom. So his defining flaw is realized, but then his defining flaw is rebuked. And you think, all right, so everything's going to go good. But his defining flaw is repeated. In chapter 18 and verse 1, we read that, where he joins affinity with Ahab. But in chapter 20 and verse 35, chapter 20 and verse 35, it says, and after this did Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, join himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who did very wickedly. Now, who is Ahaziah? He's the son of Ahab. Ahab dies, his son takes his place, and guess what we find Jehoshaphat doing again? He's joining himself with the next generation, Ahaziah. And then you find this, it says, and he joined himself with him. And then Jehoram, up there, Ahaziah dies, Jehoram takes his place, his brother takes his place. And in 2 Kings, you have to turn here, I'll just read this to you, but 2 Kings, so Ahab was the king up there, he died, Ahaziah seems to have taken his place, and Jehoshaphat was affinity with Ahab, with Ahaziah, Ahaziah dies, and Jehoram the third now takes over as the king, and it says, and King Jehoram went out of Samaria the same time and numbered all Israel, and he went and sent to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, saying, the king of Moab hath rebelled against me. Wilt thou go with me against Moab to battle? And Jehoshaphat said, I will go up. I am as thou art. My people as thy people. My horses as thy horses. So this is not just once off where he makes a mistake and makes a very bad decision by joining affinity with Ahab. He does so also, even after being rebuked by the prophet of God for doing so, he then goes and makes a league as well with the son and with both his sons, with the next two kings that are on the throne. This is a reoccurring flaw in Jehoshaphat's life. He wants unity. He's this cry for unity. We're all the same. We're all of the same lineage. Let's all be one. I'm here to help you. God wasn't for it. Now, in all of this, there was marriages, which is the part that we want to make point of. Godly taking ungodly, being joined, and the result of those mixed marriages leads to apostasy, leads to the judgment of God. Look at chapter number 21 of 2 Chronicles. Now, Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers. Finally, he died. Now the kingdom is going to go to his son, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And Jehoram his son reigned in his stead. So now Jehoram, his son, is going to be king. Jehoshaphat, a good, godly king. And verse 2, and he had brethren, the sons of Jehoshaphat, Azariah, and their father, verse 3, gave them great gifts of silver and gold. But the kingdom he gave to Jehoram, because he was the firstborn. Now verse 4 says, now when Jehoram was risen up to the kingdom of his father, he strengthened himself and slew all the brethren with the sword, and divers also of the princes of Israel. That's how he starts his kingdom. Kills all his brothers to strengthen himself as king in Judah. Verse 5 says, and Jehoram was 32 years old. 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, the false worship, the Baal worship, all of the wickedness and the ungodliness that was going on in the northern kingdom. Now we find Jehoram in the southern kingdom doing what the wicked Israelites were doing in the north. He walked, verse 6, and he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, like as did the house of Ahab, the ungodly, wicked Ahab. For he had the daughter of Ahab to wife. Now who is the daughter of Ahab? Who is the wife of Ahab? Jezebel. So Jezebel's daughter is married to Jehoram, the king of the south. What do you know about Jezebel? What's the words, for those that have read the Bible and are familiar with Jezebel, what is a word or a phrase, or how would you describe Jezebel? Evil? Wicked? The dogs did like her in the end. They licked her blood. That is true. That's how the story ends. But what you read from Jezebel is she is a powerful woman. She's powerful. She is controlling. When Naboth had that vineyard that Ahab wanted, and Ahab went to go buy the vineyard of Naboth that was next door to the palace, and Naboth said, I can't, this is my heritage for my family, I can't give it to you, Ahab. And Ahab said, oh, but I want to build, I want to dig up and make a herb garden here. And Naboth said, look, I can't do it. This is my family. And Ahab said, look, blank check, whatever it is, I'll write it. And Naboth said, I can't do it. It's my heritage, it's my family, can't do it. He goes back, and Jezebel hears about it. And what does Jezebel do? She says, right, I'll take care of this. And she has it organized for Naboth to be killed. She raises up 2 men that give a lying witness against him, false witnesses. He gets killed. She takes the land and gives it to Ahab and says, here it is, I fixed the problem for you. That's Jezebel. In fact, when Jezebel heard that Elijah had killed 400 of the prophets on Mount Carmel, she said, I swear by the gods that if Elijah is not dead by this time tomorrow. But that's Jezebel. Powerful, you don't cross Jezebel. That was the personality of who Jezebel was. In fact, so much was her personality, so strong of a person that Jezebel was, you find that you have the spirit of Jezebel mentioned in the churches. In the Revelation, at the church at Pergamos. And they have to hear the spirit of that Jezebel. And she's mentioned again in Revelation. Such is the legacy that she leaves. She is not a person who treads carefully through the tulips. No, if she's on a mission, she's stomping through those tulips and she's coming after you. That's Jezebel. Now, I only paint that picture to say this. What do you think the personality of the daughter of Jezebel may have been? I would say similar. There is a phrase in the Bible that used like mother, like daughter, like mother. It's used in Ezekiel and it's referred to Samaria and Israel. Is this idea of like daughter, like mother. So here is the daughter. Now the daughter of Jezebel, her name is Athaliah. So Athaliah is married to Jehoram. And Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, is now doing wickedness in Judah because his wife is the daughter of Jezebel, that wicked Jezebel. He has her as his wife. And now you find here, and he walked in the ways of Israel. He didn't walk in the ways of Jehoshaphat, his father, who loved God. He is walking in the wickedness of Israel. Because of this marriage that came in, brought in the wickedness, brought in apostasy, and it brought in the anger of God because of it. That's the generation. I want to say this to you. That mixed marriages leads to apostasy, which leads to the judgment of God, but doesn't always happen in one generation. It didn't happen in Jehoshaphat's day. The decisions that he made in making an affinity with the ungodly had an impact not so much on his life, but it had an impact on the generation which was to follow. It had an impact on his son and then on the next generation as well. So you have Jehoram here in chapter 21. He reigned and he had the daughter of Ahab to wife. Ahaziah, the next generation, the next king of Judah, so Jehoshaphat in the south. Jehoshaphat was good, Jehoram wicked because of who his wife was. And Ahaziah, it says in chapter 22, or chapter 22, the next chapter says this. So Jehoram is only there for 8 years. He dies. And the inhabitants, chapter 22, verse 1 says, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, the youngest son, king in his stead. So the grandson now of Jehoshaphat. I know there's lots of lineages here. Please stay with, try and get it in your head as much as you can. So the youngest son here in his king in his stead. And in the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp had slain all the eldest. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned. So in the south, there is Jehoshaphat, good. His son, Jehoram, then reigns, has the daughter of Jezebel, Athaliah, as his wife, does wicked, does like the kings of Israel. He dies. God kills him. Now you have his son, the next generation, which is Ahaziah. Who is Ahaziah's mother? Athaliah. His mum is the daughter of Jezebel. All right? Now, how does this play out in the next generation? Ahaziah, look at verse 1. Ahaziah reigned. Verse 2, verse 3. At the end of verse 2. His mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri, or the granddaughter, rather, of Omri. Verse 3, he also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor to do wickedly. Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah, is now having influence in the political and spiritual affairs of the kingdom of Judah in the south because of what Jehoshaphat made affinity with in his generation. He went and became friends with the ungodly. Instead of separating himself and saying, no, we're not going to have things to do with the ungodly, we're going to stay and serve God for ourselves, he tried to bring unity. Let's all hold hands. And he brought the two, which should have been separate, he brought them back together and tried to unify them. And in trying to unify them through marriage, he ends up bringing apostasy into Judah and into Jerusalem. And look at the next. Do you know who rules after Ahaziah? No. Does anybody know who rules after Ahaziah? Look at verse number 10 of chapter 22. And when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal of the house of Judah. In 2 Kings, it says this in chapter 11, and when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal. And it says in the end of verse 3, and Athaliah did reign over the land. Jehoshaphat was a good, godly man. He feared God. He didn't walk in the ways of Baal. He didn't walk in the ways of Israel. He didn't do what they were doing. He served God wholeheartedly and truly, and he led his people to follow God wholeheartedly and truly. But he made peace and unity with that northern kingdom, and then his son and his son's wife does wicked. His grandson does wicked. And now he has this daughter-in-law of his, Athaliah, the mother of his grandson, is now the queen. The daughter of Jezebel is now the ruling queen of Judah for 6 years. I can't remember, I didn't write this down how long Ahaziah, someone can read that and find it. How long Ahaziah was ruling. 8 years, I think. So he ruled for 8 years. And Jehoram ruled for 8 years. So 16 years have passed. 16 years have passed from when Jehoshaphat died to when Athaliah is queen. 16 years ago. Now, for the youngest in here, 16 years sounds like a million light years away. But for the majority of us, 16 years ago was 2005. 2005. That wasn't that long ago. Could you imagine good, godly Jehoshaphat dying in 2005, and this year, wicked daughter of Jezebel becomes queen of his godly kingdom? In 16 short years, a massive shift takes place. And for every generation after this, you find the Baal worship that was in the northern kingdom is now found in the southern kingdom. Jezebel, the daughter of the high priest of the Zidonians, she brought in Baal worship into Israel. Now Jezebel's daughter is bringing Baal worship into Jerusalem. Now, turn if you would to Jeremiah. Jeremiah. The chronology goes on. The stories go on. King comes along, king dies. King comes along, king dies. There was good kings. Joash was a good king in amongst all of that. There were good kings in the Judah during that time. But you get to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah prophesies right when God is sending Nebuchadnezzar to take them out of the land. And their main reason that they are taken out of the land is for their idolatry. Chapter number 9, Jeremiah chapter number 9. Chapter number 9 and verse 12 says, "Who is a wise man that may understand this?" All this taking on. Who's going to be wise and understand what's happening here? "And who is he to whom the mouth of the Lord hath spoken, that he may declare it? For what the land perisheth and is burned up like a wilderness, that none passes through. And the Lord said, Because they have forsaken my law which I set before them, and have not obeyed my voice, neither walked therein, but have walked after the imagination of their own heart, and after Balaam." They're now walking after Balaam. This is Israel. This is not Israel, this is Judah. This is in Jerusalem, the southern kingdom. They're walking after Balaam in Jeremiah's time. And how did they learn this? Which their fathers taught them. Their fathers taught them to walk after Balaam. And where did their fathers learn it from? Their fathers, and it can be traced back to Jezebel and the daughter of Jezebel, bringing it from the northern kingdom into the southern kingdom, the wickedness of Baal worship, and now this is going to bring about the utter destruction of the temple, of Jerusalem, the walls, the holy people. They're going to rip them all out. And all of this can be traced back that they learnt Balaam from their fathers and from their fathers and from their fathers, and ultimately from their king and from their king's mother and their king's wife, and back it's tracked. Because Jehoshaphat allowed it. Though he was godly and he feared God, he made affinity and he joined what should never have been joined. And generations later, the judgment of God comes upon them because they did not separate what should have been separate. They joined what should have been separate. In Ezekiel, which prophesies around the same time, he says, "And they have not put a difference between the holy and profane." No difference. There's no difference between Israel and Samaria. And Samaria was even worse because they had made affinity with all the other gods and nations around it. So he says they learn it from their fathers. Look at chapter 11 of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter number 11. And verse 13. It says, "For according to the number of thy cities are thy gods, O Judah," southern kingdom, supposed to be the godly one. "And according to the number of the streets of Jerusalem have you set up altars to that shameful thing, even altars to burn incense unto Baal." Baal worship was so prevalent in Jerusalem a number of generations later that it says as many as streets there are in Jerusalem is as many idols as there are to Baal. Everywhere. It just completely took over the city to the place that God said, "I'm going to destroy this place. I'm going to destroy it because of their idolatry." Baal worship was everywhere. And again, we ask the question, where did it come from? It came from the northern kingdom, which came from the Zidonians, which can be tracked back through Athaliah and Jezebel, which ultimately can be tracked back to Jehoshaphat making decisions. Though he was godly and never worshipped Baal, he made affinities and unity where there should never have been unity. Chapter 23. chapter number 23. Of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 23. Jeremiah 23, verse 11, says this, "For both the prophet and priest are profane." Irreverent is what profane means. Irreverent. "For both the prophet and priest are profane. Yea, in my house have I found their wickedness, saith the Lord." There is irreverence in the house of God. The temple that Solomon built, irreverence. Profanity. Verse 12 says, "Wherefore their way shall be unto them as slippery ways in the darkness. They shall drive on and fall therein. For I will bring evil upon them, even the year of their visitation, saith the Lord. And I have seen folly in the prophets of Samaria. They prophesied in Baal and caused my people Israel to err." They taught them, the people. The people learnt this from the leaders who brought these things in. And there's profanity. There is profanity in the house of God. They have profaned it. Irreverence is there. "In my house," he says. And there's not meant to be. It's meant to be clean. But they have brought the unclean in. And the unclean, if you have a dirty hand and you have a clean hand, and you put the two together, and you pull them away, the clean hand doesn't make the dirty hand clean. The dirty hand makes the clean hand dirty. That's exactly what has taken place. The clean hand of Judah has joined in affinity with the dirty hand of the northern kingdom, and now they're both sullied, dirtied, profaned, unclean. That's why he's saying there needs to be a difference between the clean and the unclean, between the holy and the unholy. You say, what does all this have to do with today? Well, you have to understand, Jehoshaphat made some decisions in his life for the sake of unity that compromised the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. Even though he may have had a big heart for doing it and in his own mind right reasons for doing it. But he allowed in and he built bridges that should never have been built. God broke those bridges and separated them. And Jehoshaphat rebuilt them and brought them back in. And his sons, his grandsons, and on till numerous generations down the track, the ultimate judgment of God came for Baal worship, for the very thing that Jehoshaphat was responsible for. What does that have to do with us? I'm going to deal with this a little bit more next week, but let me say this to you. The decisions that are made today by God-fearing individuals have an impact on the next generation and the next generation. What you allow in has an impact on your children and on your children's children. I'll give you one illustration of this in a church setting. One illustration of this in a church setting. People often say, why is our music the way it is? This topic that we're talking about tonight is central and foundational to the way our church operates. We are different and distinct. People walk into our church and say, you guys are different. Why do you guys still sing hymns? Everyone else is singing Hillsong, which is true. If you were to look on YouTube, you look around churches today, they've got the band, they've got the drums, they've got the electric guitar, they've got the lights, they've got the smoke machine. It's a darkened studio. Everything is black, the lights are off, and they're playing songs that sound very similar to what you'd hear on the radio. And those decisions were made by a generation of godly pastors who loved God, but said, you know what? If we make unity with the world's music and bring that in, then we will be able to reach more people. This is what happened in the 80s and the 90s. And they brought in the world's music. But in so doing, they brought in a whole host of additional things that came with it. Instead of it being separate and distinct, the holy and the unholy. Now there is this unholy music that is now brought in, and they've just changed the lyrics, changed the words, and everything is, they say, oh, it's fine. Now we're singing about Jesus instead of singing about adultery and singing about the girlfriend cheating on me. Now it's about Jesus. But it's essentially the same stuff. It's bringing in the world into the church. When I was as a teenager, I did a study on contemporary Christian music. In that particular day, jars of clay, and I think they're still around today, but jars of clay were big. They were a big contemporary Christian band in the late 90s. Now, when I went on their website reading up, their influences, they asked, it was just like a biography of the band. What are your influences? Who influences your music style? One of their influences, and I can't remember the other ones, but the ones that I do remember was Nirvana. The Kurt Cobain, maybe that was my generation as well. But here is a Christian rock band singing about Jesus, saying, we get our musical style and influence from Nirvana, who Kurt Cobain blew his brains out and committed suicide, was a drug addict, and all of those other things that went with it, was a very immoral, ungodly man. He says, this is who we get our influence from. Surely something should say, this is not right. Surely the Christian ought not be going to the ungodly and saying, this is what we want to style ourselves after. And they have built bridges to the world, and they have brought it in. Now, for a whole generation, they're saying this. They're saying, oh, you know what, it's all fine. It's all good. We're just praising God with great enthusiasm and great zeal. But you know what has happened in that particular time? Music has expanded in churches. And churches are now judged by their music programs, by the music that they have and what they play and how it is and how well their music program is. That's why Hillsong, or as David calls it, Hellsong, that's why Hillsong is so big the world over, massive, massive people, because people are drawn to Christianity because of the music. Now, how is the music helping people to live a righteous and a godly life? It's not. Do you know how I can say that? Because there are churches today bigger than they have ever been. Tens of thousands of people go to churches, go to Hillsong. Thousands and thousands of people go to churches in our city. There are churches in our city that are filled with thousands of people. You think, surely if churches today have thousands and thousands of people in them, surely the influence of godliness should be felt in our generation. Is it? And we're as ungodly as we've ever been, and getting worse. But the churches are full in that sense. What is going on? But if you were to go back to the 50s, you would find a whole heap of churches that were 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 people. Little country churches scattered all over the place in America and out Australia and at different places. Little tiny churches that just got up and sang simple little songs. But you know what? The pulpits were on fire with the righteousness of God. And the preacher would get up and preach, thus saith the Lord. And you know what? In those times when the churches were small and the music was simple, but the preaching took preeminence, the nations were godlier and morality was better. And they've brought in now the worldliness, and they're saying, oh, that we're filling the house of God up with this music. Right, but there's no substance to godliness. It's emotional and it's worldly. And people will say, oh, no, that's fine. No, I'm using it to worship God. And there is a godly generation who use the ungodly music to worship God. But I'm not so here to argue about the godly who are compromising this generation. I am fearful for the generation that's going to come that is going to be even more ungodly. And they are going to do like after the world and not after God. And people are going to say, what happened here? In just one generation, we went from godly church leaders and ministry leaders, and now their children, their offspring, are worldly and ungodly false prophets. What happened? Well, those godly leaders brought in worldliness into the house of God. And they didn't keep separated what God intended to keep separated. that the clean and the unclean be separate and not linked and joined. And this is a tale that repeats again and again and again. And we might say, oh, isn't it great? We got churches with thousands of people today. Thousands of people are going to these churches. Isn't this great? Unity. And lots of compromise comes under the banner of unity. But the prophets rise up, and Jehu and Elisha and Elijah, all of them had to condemn Jehoshaphat and say, you are doing wrong by joining yourself with the ungodly. You don't need to be trying to make friends with them. You need to be separate and distinct and serve God. Here's the irony in it all. Those links are made to reach the world. If we become like the world, we'll reach the world. That's the mentality and the logic behind it. To bridge those gaps to try and bring them to Christ. But again, the unclean doesn't make, the clean doesn't make the unclean clean. It makes the other way around. So by them joining with the world, they actually sully and dirty their own testimony for Christ, and they don't end up reaching the world because they just become like the world. But on the other side, if you are separate and distinct and holy and peculiar and trying to live godly in an ungodly world, that how you dress and how you talk and how you go about living your life, you seek to please God and your favor is with God rather than trying to find the favor of man, that you seek God. Do you know the irony of it is? You actually reach people. And the godly influence actually increases by being separate and distinct from the world. But the more you try and join in with them, the less the godly influence. The godly influence actually is watered down so that it becomes non-existent. Or until you get to a place where you have only Noah was righteous in his generation. What happened? Well, the godly and the ungodly came together and mixed and mingled, and the godly learned the way of the ungodly. We're going to do some more practicality on this and how this plays out in everyday life next week. Because what you allow in and what you make friends with in your personal life and in your family's life may have a much larger impact on the next generation than you realize. And we must be careful for that. And as much as our swing is to say, oh man, I'd love to we'll just throw everything open and we'll revamp everything to make our church so appealing to everybody and everybody. We're not here to make church appealing to lost people. We're here to please God and to preach Jesus Christ. And we're here to lift up Jesus Christ. And as we lift up Jesus Christ, he says, I will draw all men unto me. And they will change. And their hearts will change. And we grow by actually being separate. We're not trying to be exclusive. That's not the same. But we are trying to be distinct and separate. And so the decisions that we make here as a church has to do with not following in the paths of Jehoshaphat, who joined affinity and harmonized and brought unity, and the next generations all had to deal with the consequences of his decision. We're going to try the best we can to just be separate, be distinct, and to be godly, and to try and reach men and women with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's our goal. That's our goal. And so we look at Jehoshaphat and we say, there's some things that we can learn. There's some things that we can learn from the life of Jehoshaphat. The godly, he was a godly man, but he was a compromiser. And the effects that it had. Connor, when you come and take our hymn books and we'll close with a song tonight.